listening to the Culture Magnetic Podcast with your host, CR Pendleton.
What Jesus is.
Hey everyone, welcome to the next installment of Culture Magnetic Podcast. As the name implies, culture is a focus for us. We want to make church culture attractive. We want to encourage church growth. And part of that is having some great people on the podcast. And today we have some great ones, some great old friends of mine. Tim Armstrong, Pastor Tim Armstrong, who is the senior pastor of the chapel in Akron, which we're here today. And this is where we're actually tracking today. And he has the worthy walk. I accidentally called it the unworthy walk, but I think that's because I was thinking of myself. And the worthy walk, not the unworthy walk. It has been on the radio, and you're transitioning over to podcast and more digital market. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. And Jason Allison, who is the senior pastor of Terra Community Church, and you also work with Converge and coach pastors and do the Unfiltered Pastors, it's podcast, live stream, that type of thing. And I want to get into all of those things, but it's so awesome to have you guys on the program today. So thank you for doing this.
Good to be here. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so getting into it, one of the big things was I was hanging out with Jason. I do see Jason on a more regular basis, and I was like, you know what? I would love to get to the bottom of those early years when you guys were a part of planting a church in Mansfield, Ohio, called Crossroads Community Church.
Right.
And I happened to be on staff there for a short period of time. So I'm actually sitting here with my old boss, really, from almost 16, 17 years ago. So I wanted to get to some of those things and kind of visit your experiences as you've done that and moved on into other spaces. So let's just go back there. Yeah. Tim, can you tell me about what was those first years like, the early stages?
Yeah, it was kind of a crazy ride. So I graduated from seminary in '96, and the church I had previously been a youth pastor at, they had been wanting to plant a church, part of a conference that was very aggressive in church planting, and so they called me back from seminary and said, "Hey, you want to plant a church for us?" And so we considered it carefully and decided to come back to our hometown. Took about 20 or 30 people as our core group, about 20 miles away, basically, from the mother church, and started meeting first as a core group, a small group, and our goal was to launch that year in October, but we were so green. We didn't know what we were doing. And we were anxious to get going, and so we actually launched in August, which is like you never launch in August.
Yeah, that's tough.
In the middle of the summer, in a junior high gym with no air conditioning, and we had just been praying and we'd been seeking the Lord and been working on kind of the logistics of how to put a service together and how to serve people. And so that first service was, we were just saying, can you invite all your friends? Just invite, if we could double our numbers, bring one person. And we did. And we had, I think, 70 that first service. It was a great service. And then that week was the longest week of my life, between that first service and the second service. Remember that, Jason, when you planted Terra? It's like you're wondering if anybody's going to come back, and double the number came back.
Wow!
We were scrambling to set up chairs, and the next week, double that number came back. So we were pulling out bleachers, and it just kept doing that for a while until we outgrew that area. And by October, we moved across the street into the high school auditorium, which was much larger, and kind of took off. And so, we look back on it now, it's like, what in the world?
Yeah.
We're just holding on to everything that we had, and the Lord kept bringing people. And, in those early years, people ask me, well, so what do you count it for? And I think the typical answer is, God.
Yeah.
But when you really break it down in church planters, like, come on, tell me what else was going on. What was the dynamic? Mm-hmm. You'll know this, and you'll know this too, as being part of from that area. We were the first in the area to have what we called then was a contemporary service. Mm-hmm. No one else was doing it. Mm. And I think we were scratching an itch that the community really needed. So,
yeah, we always, I went to high school in Mansfield, and we always joke that Mansfield was at least 15 to 20 years behind the curve, in culture and everything. So being the mid-90s, that was, they were ripe and ready for a contemporary church to come and to scratch an itch, like you said. Yeah,
there's a dynamic, being in the right place at the right time. But and you, kind of the hometown boy as well. There's something about that dynamic as you watch other church planters. At first, I thought this was like a totally unique experience, and then you start hearing stories, and you find out that's a very common story.
Absolutely.
Your hometown guy in a place that they know the pulse really well, mm-hmm. they know the people very well, and they know how to speak into the culture. And the Lord kind of uses that to multiply and to draw and attract, and the church grows.
Absolutely. Now that's tremendous, because speaking into the culture, being aware of the culture, obviously I use the word culture a lot because I believe that it's absolutely important that you're in touch with it in order to be able to move it, lead it, motivate. So you were mobile in those first few months, was it? Okay.
And quite a bit, almost a year and a half.
Okay.
We were totally mobile in a high school auditorium, and it wasn't until much later that we kind of found a warehouse, a back of a warehouse, no less. In fact, it was the back of a warehouse. I always used to joke, you had to know somebody to know where Crossroads was.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. And Jason, you came into the picture right around that time when the building, you guys moved into the building, and Jason comes into the picture. And so what was that experience like? This was a new experience for you. You're coming back to your hometown. Tell me about that.
Yeah. And actually, when I was in high school, Tim was my youth pastor.
Wow.
So, I remember it was Christmas break my senior year. Tim comes over to the house and sitting on my couch and tells me that he sees some gifts of ministry in me, and asks if I'd consider going into the ministry and maybe serving as an intern, with him that summer. And, I tell people now, I kind of point back to that time as when I really sensed that call into ministry, and God used Tim to do it. As much as it pains me to admit that sometimes. But so I, did that, went off to college, and was actually working I was the children's pastor at a large church in northern Kentucky. And, Tim and I had stayed in touch, and when I heard he had planted, and I'd actually come up to visit because, my wife has family there, and I'd seen him and so forth. And I'd seen the way the church had started to grow. And he called me and said, "Hey, this thing's growing really fast, and I really need some help. Would you consider coming up and working with me?" And it was fun for me because I went from, it was a large church, but it was very traditional.
What church?
It was First Church of Christ in Burlington, Kentucky.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And I went, and I was a children's pastor. I had about 500 kids in the youth group.
Awesome.
So it was a big type thing. I was the administrator of a preschool. I had all that stuff. So went up to Mansfield, and it was fun because you go into a church plant, especially the style that we were doing then. There's a lot of freedom. We could be creative, we could do crazy things, and it was just fun.
Yeah.
And so that was part, I walk into this, and we just get to be creative and just try things. And all of it was based around, what do we need to do in order to help people meet God?
Yes.
What are things that we could do that normally you wouldn't even think of trying?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of when I went up and started there, and that was the exciting part to me, was being able to be that creative and just enjoy the ride. Like we had fun together.
Yeah.
And that was unheard of among church staffs a lot. And so for me, the experience was just enjoyable.
So it was very inspiring. It was a very time for you guys to thrive. and really experiment with some new ideas. And they were picking up and they were taking off because I'm from the same town. I'm a few years younger than Jason. And I was like college age and living next door to you at that point in time. And I was involved in church culture, and I was working with the youth staff at another church in town. But what was happening was so incredible with Crossroads. And you guys were impacting so many people, and it was just snowballing and taking off. So I got to step in with you guys in the early 2000s there and come on with the youth staff there. And I'll tell you, it was a massively inspirational space for me because it was the first time that I actually saw or experienced a church staff where you guys were doing real leadership development. There was assessment going on. I talked with Jason about this. That was is probably one of the tools that have stayed with me all of these years in ministry. Was those early days of getting that assessment, doing staff retreats and things that were really. It was very motivational. It was creating a culture in the organization of everyone being for each other. So I picked up on those things. I recognized that, and that kind of stayed with me. So even though I was only there for a short period of time, that was pretty influential. So I saw that continue, and you guys made a massive impact in that area, and Crossroads has grown tremendously even since those days. And we don't have to spend all the time on Crossroads because you guys have done so many things since then. But it's left such a legacy there. You were even going multi-site. So now, like we've mentioned, you are the senior pastor of the chapel here in Akron. But before you left, you had started going multi-site with Crossroads, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So what was the experience in those years? From 2003 to when 2012 was when you came here, or 14?
So it was 14, so a little over 4 years ago.
Okay.
And we really started more with church planting at Crossroads first.
Okay.
Just the desire to plant autonomous churches, and then we started experimenting with multi-site, and really we were kind of cutting our teeth and making a ton of mistakes. And figuring out what we knew and what we didn't know.
Sure.
In those early, and I look back on those now, and I think I'm thankful that the church was so willing to try a lot of things and keep what works.
Right. Yeah.
And that's kind of how it was our mantra. Unfortunately, we tried it in such a way as a lot of people saw us fail.
Yeah.
And they would look at us and say, well, that didn't work, and you guys are starting to slip, But in reality, I think that's what you have to do. You have to step out there.
Yeah.
And you have to try things, even if it's dangerous.
Yeah.
For you.
And see, that's part of the thing that I really wanted to get to with you guys is that this is not a process where everything goes smooth.
Oh, never.
Every decision you make, it just works out.
Right.
And, so you went through some hard spaces of making some efforts and doing some experimental things, and some of those things didn't work out. And in that process, can you describe for our listeners a little bit? That's gut wrenching sometimes when you go through those things. And I'm sure there's people listening to this right now. There's we've tried, we've thrown our heart into this thing, and we're just getting chewed up right now. So tell us a little bit about some experiences that you had during that time.
Well, it would be fun to actually, we haven't talked a lot about it,
No.
but when we planted Jason, there was some transition there that I felt like we could have done better. And I think in hindsight, we could have supported our church plant better. But I think also Berean probably could have said the same thing about Crossroads.
Right.
Where, in hindsight, many years later, they said, man, we could have done that better. And I think that's the thing that we are learning today. How do you plant a church and you do it well? Because there's this delicate balance between wanting to build in the DNA of the culture that the church is coming from, but yet also leaving it in the hands of the church planter. That's one aspect. Then when you start talking about multi-siting, that exponentially gets exploded because you definitely want to build a DNA in
Right.
to that campus, but that campus is being planted in its own cultural, many times, region with its own campus pastor that has its own cultural background.
Yes.
My gosh, the dynamics are infinitesimal. I mean, we have all kinds of things that we have to deal with. So, it depends which direction you want to go, but church planting or campus ministries, either way, they both have a ton of complexities to them.
I think we're talking about a lot of failure.
Yeah, I think we're fallen humans, and I think there's an aspect we got to talk more.
Yeah.
We got to be more vulnerable with one another, and I think there's many times I sit in rooms with guys where I have my hands under the table and I have them open, and it's just me and the Lord, and it's like my gut is churning, and I'm like, I got to let this go. I have such a desire to lead hard, but you can't do that. There's a bunch of stallions in the room. They want to lead.
Yeah.
You just got to kind of corral, and those are sometimes difficult.
That's incredibly significant because that's high-level leadership there. When you get to the point where you've done an awful lot, you've learned those hard lessons, but now you've got to prepare some space for someone else to fail and learn those hard lessons.
Right.
Giving them room to fail.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, again, whichever way we're going here, if we talk about campuses, doing multi-site or planting churches, failure is going to be a massive part of that.
Right.
It's a big part of the learning curve. So, Jason, you planted out of Crossroads. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, it was one of those things where, I call myself the reluctant church planter because I kind of went into it kicking and screaming, partially because I was part of Crossroads where everything went pretty well. The growth curve, everything was rolling, and all the metrics was saying it was a success and all these things. And so it was kind of one of those, I was a little scared to try anything else because that had gone so well. And, you can't really go beyond that in a lot of ways. And also my gift mix and everything. And I had a really good gig at Crossroads, working with Tim. We had a good relationship. We had, good things going. But I just really sensed God telling me, your job really doesn't require faith anymore. You're just kind of doing it because you're doing it, and you're good at it, and that's fine. But you really need to, for your own growth, you need to step out and do some other things. And so, ended up the whole process happened, and we left to plant. The funny thing is, I never felt like Crossroads didn't support me. From my end of it, I never once had a complaint of any kind, really. So it's funny to hear you say that, looking back, like I never felt that. Obviously were there things, of course, but in the same breath, you got to let your kids fly. Yeah. Sometimes you can't give them everything, because that's not what's best for them. But yeah, when we planted in Delaware, Ohio, it's about an hour south of Mansfield. And we had about a group of 15 to 20 that made that drive for the first 9 months or so, just to help get things going. And then I was kind of on my own.
And that's where I think the failure happened, that I feel.
Okay.
Because when we were planted out of Berean, I felt like we outgrew the mothership pretty quickly. And I don't know what happened there. And I felt like I was alone. Like I was left alone by the senior pastor.
Right.
And then I repeated that mistake. And I don't think I did it intentionally.
No.
I think ministry was busy, and you and I have always had a great relationship. Yeah. But in hindsight, I thought, man, if there was one thing I learned from that, I would have invested more time in just walking with you through those early church plant. It's good to hear that you felt like it went well and there wasn't any issues. But personally, I felt like, man, I wish I would have invested a good solid amount of strategic time. Right. Even like, how our kids sometimes push us away as parents, even if that would have been a bit of the experience, even just to be there.
Right.
Just to
Right.
always be catching lunch or,
Yeah.
hour and a half or hour 20 minutes, not that far. And that was for me a catalytic moment
Okay.
where I was like, okay, I'm not going to let that happen again.
Right.
I'm
glad I could help.
yeah, failure, man.
Well, the story goes, I mean, you launched and everything went perfect, right?
Oh yeah.
And
no. But it once the group from Crossroads, went back home, so to speak, I felt a little bit like a parachute church plant where I dropped into a community that I really had no connections there and had to start from scratch, building all those roots and building all those connections and relationships. And, but it's 12 and a half years later and we're still there. They haven't kicked me out yet, and the church is still going, and we're still seeing people come to know Christ. It's not anything like the growth curve that Crossroads experienced, but it's it's still happening, and God is still present, and God is still good, and God is still drawing people to Himself through the ministry there. So, it's one of those. Yeah, the experience was almost the polar opposite. And that's part of my fear of planting was that is what would happen, and that's exactly what happened. And yet in the process, what I learned was that God is with me in both of those experiences.
Yeah.
And the outcome isn't what God is basing how much He loves me on. That's already been decided. And so now the question is, will I be faithful and enjoy God's presence in the journey, whether it's at Crossroads at that time when, things are hitting on all cylinders, or after when I feel a little bit like I'm out on my own, doing this thing. And then how can I kind of learn from it now with the guys that I coach and work with?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to, because you're leveraging that now. You are helping other pastors with Converge. You're coaching them in the process. You do it outside of Converge as well.
Yeah.
You're just naturally a pastory type of guy. But and beyond that, you're doing the Unfiltered Pastors thing, which is great. And you're talking about the challenges, right?
Yeah.
Some of the real issues that you face.
Yeah. The Unfiltered Pastors, there's 4 of us that we just a year and a half ago just started getting together for breakfast, because we were all in similar situations of, not even close to the same church background. We have Methodist, a Nazarene, and then a Southern Baptist, and then me, and we get together and just
a wild party right there.
I was gonna say.
Yeah. But we just
I'd like to parachute in on that one, talking about parachuting.
Well, yeah, but that's kind of we were sitting around at Bob Evans having breakfast one day talking about some spiritual development stuff just within our own life, and I looked at the guys and I said, wouldn't it be amazing if each of our congregations could hear some of these conversations, because we're just sharing our hearts. This isn't a prepared sermon. This isn't planned out anything, but what we're sharing is stuff that people actually want to hear. And so I said, what if we just started doing a Facebook Live where we could just let our people listen when we start to talk about stuff like that? And that's where the Unfiltered Pastors thing kind of started. And we've done 2, and there's a 3rd one coming up in January 31st it's just a Facebook Live.
Yeah.
It's not anything, and the way we structured it is one of the guys acts as the host and picks the topic and works through some questions. The other 3 guys don't know anything about it until we click record, and then it's just conversation. And then we can take some questions through the comments and things like that. But it's just us talking.
Yeah.
And part of that is because we didn't have a space to just talk. As pastors, you can't just go hang out with some people in your congregation and talk about the struggles that you're having about hearing God in a certain season of life, because they don't want to, they can't imagine that the pastor who they look up to is struggling with hearing from God.
Yeah.
And so, having that support, and, again, I didn't feel that necessarily, but I do see what you're saying. And maybe that's why I've gone so much into coaching other pastors who are in situations like that and just spending time with them, because I know that need is so there.
Yes.
And having someone just to process, I don't have any new insight to share with them necessarily, but I can at least talk to them and let them know they're being heard and they're not alone.
Yeah. That's one thing. Whenever I'm talking with pastors or church leaders, I'm like, there's probably nothing I'm going to tell you that you don't already know. I'll just hold up a mirror. I'll be the soundboard that you can bounce things off of. But the reality is you're probably not going to give any pastor who's on the front lines and doing all the work and has read all the books, not really going to give them new information that they don't know and haven't experienced firsthand. Speaking of which, Tim, you come down here. We're talking. So you do the Crossroads thing. You grow that thing up, and it's still moving on and flourishing and going multi-site. Mm-hmm. But in 2014, you got an opportunity to come here to the chapel in Akron. Right. So
yeah, there was a few years where there was a restlessness. I felt the Lord was doing something. Mm-hmm. There's clearly sometimes. Where I knew there was a conclusion coming. We didn't know what it was. And my heart had always been to have the opportunity to be aggressively involved in church planting and multiplication at another level, a level that beyond maybe what Crossroads could provide. And I had some other opportunities, and I just didn't feel like those were the right doors to walk through. And then, long story how I got here, but ultimately arrived here at the chapel. And the chapel has just been a wonderful environment. Already had a seasoned heart for planting churches. I think they've already planted like 16 other campuses or other churches before I got here, and their 85-year history and large international work. And so I just resonated with it. Came here with a vision to plant churches. And the people rallied around that. And so that's what we're in the midst of doing right now. We call it Saturate. And so we're seeking to plant 10 campuses in 10 years, as well as do multiple ventures around the globe with 5 strategic partners planting churches in other countries.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, was the church planting thing, had that morphed into any multi-site campus launches at that point? Was that before you got here, or did you bring that in?
Yeah, so interesting experiment that happened here at the chapel before I arrived. This place was just bursting at the seams many years ago under Newt Larson, who was the senior pastor. And I think they were holding 5 services, and they couldn't contain the place. And so they actually went to an area where I live called Green, and they built a second campus that's identical to this one. It's a $21 million campus.
Wow.
It was an interesting strategy. I mean, they built a second campus, and they divided their congregation, and they sent half to the suburbs, and they kept half here. And so in that day, it made quite a bit of news. It was one of the only multi-sites that had 2 mega campuses, basically. Then they, because of their other planting endeavors, had one of their churches was failing in an area called Wadsworth, so they picked it back up, and that became their 3rd campus. That campus is now doing very well. And so when I came here, there were 3 campuses.
Okay.
And since then, we've launched 2 more, and we're getting ready to launch a 3rd. And so their mindset was already campus ministry. Now, the difference was they had a desire for every campus to have the exact same culture identity.
Okay. Yeah.
And everything was streamed from here.
Okay.
And I radically changed that when I came.
Okay. And so obviously you've gone on and you've launched 2 campuses since then, and you're in the process of launching another one right now, right?
Correct.
Okay. So this is a huge challenge when churches want to go multi-site, and they're trying to develop that the track to run on. So the challenge becomes, what do you do with leadership development? How do you find campus pastors?
Right.
So can you speak into that at all?
Yeah, and again, it goes back to some of the mistakes we made in the early Crossroads years, and looking back on some of the things I think were even mistakes here at the chapel prior to me coming. And that is the idea of trying to duplicate culture in multiple areas. When every area, it doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes away or 55 minutes away, there is cultural difference. You cannot reproduce culture. It just happens. It happens because of the area you live in. It happens because of the personality of the leader. It happens because of the personality of the staff, and the people who are coming. And so when I came here, we got rid of all the idea of sending me to all the different campuses via video, and I put campus pastor. I said, you run it 98%.
Okay.
I'm almost autonomous. We keep other things part of our DNA and our central structure and our central governance and things like that. But generally, the campus pastors, we don't preach the same sermons. We don't even lead the same way.
Okay.
And it really is dictated by the culture that they're in.
Okay.
We have very similar strategies, but even that is morphed. We don't even have the same website, believe it or not.
Wow.
Which is unique. We have the same kind of landing page, but other than that, if you go to the Kenmore campus, which is kind of a very urban, missional community, it looks completely different from, say, our Wadsworth campus
Incredible.
or our Green campus. And so that's all developed out of the leader. And the challenge then is really moving all these guys collectively together in one vision. That's kind of my job. It's like herding cats or holding marbles or however whatever metaphor you want to use. And then, as you had mentioned, it's finding the right person to come into that mix.
Yes.
And so you've heard character chemistry, and I don't remember what all the C's are, but
competency
is
the
it
other
competency?
One. Yeah.
So here's the reality of that. You just got to find a guy that fits theologically, fits socially, is kind of quirky like we are and gets it.
Yeah.
And that's just not an easy process. And so you just go through a lot of, and here's the difference. I don't want to monopolize the mic, but
feel free.
Here's the thing. Here's the major mistake I made. I thought if I could get the person with the right credentials and the right experience, I'd have the right person. That's absolutely the wrong way to go.
Okay.
You actually have to flip that completely around. And you've got to find the person with the right spiritual temperature. They may not have any experience. They might not have any of the things, the accolades that the world would, even the church planting world would say, oh yeah, that's the guy. They've got the, but they fit with you. You resonate with them. It's as if they are part of the cloth of the fabric of who we are. They've got and again, I don't want to overuse the word, but they've got this spiritual dynamic that they just fit.
Yeah. That's
the guy. And you have to just go through tons of people to figure that out. We just hired a guy from the Bronx, and he had very little experience in a particular ministry, not a campus pastor, but a particular ministry. And but he had the right whatever that was. And he's been phenomenal. He has no experience in what we've asked him to do.
Yeah.
But the Lord's been blessing him. And I think it's that team dynamic. And that's the same dynamic we look for in campus pastors.
It's funny because you did that intuitively early on at Crossroads. I mean, we didn't realize it. We couldn't systematize it. But I mean, think back on some of the people that you brought in and that we worked with. I remember, Lori and no experience, no training, but she fit.
Right.
And then part of what I saw you do was if they fit, then you would work to train them, because some things can be learned.
Right.
Right. But that spiritual connection dynamic, that's you can't learn that.
Right.
But you can learn a skill.
Right.
And you can learn how to lead.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jay. I think, and there's a sense where, and part of the fit is Like there's a work ethic that you don't even have to talk about. It's like, oh, I want to give my life to this.
Right.
And I trust you and you trust me, and we've got each other's back, and we're going to work through whatever comes. It's not ever going to be easy. That's just a dynamic that's just not easy to find.
Right. Right.
But I tell you, I'm not going to hire a person unless I get that.
Yeah.
And I keep telling our director of new campus development, who's a good friend, you know him as well, Jay, and it's like, he gets it too. We will just go through piles of resume and through hours of interviews and time with people before we pass the mantle and say, come join us, go plant a campus.
Right.
That's awesome. So when you're in that process, is it you have a partner in this, it sounds like, but do you have a team of people, or is it really kind of reliant on you and your leadership and your ability to assess?
Yeah, so no. If you just leave it on me, I guarantee I'm going to screw it all up. Our campus pastors all work very closely together in picking the next campus person.
Okay.
And so we have a guy who helps us, kind of manages what we call the residency program. And so that's 18 to 24 months of someone coming in and kind of going through the testing. We always tell them, just because you've been hired as a church planter or a campus pastor doesn't mean you're ultimately going to be that. You got to go through that process. So we feel like you're the right person, but we got to spin you around through all the campuses. We got to spend a lot of time with you, and we just want to do life with you before we hand over a ton of money, a ton of people, a ton of reputation, and out the door. We're not really in a hurry.
Sure.
We just want to do this really right, and at all the times knowing, it could go south anytime. So we all have to be on the same page. And we've had a couple candidates where some of us were like, yeah, thumbs up, and others us, no, thumbs down. And if we're not unified, we don't move forward. That's
significant. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
And so you have this residency program, and obviously, I would imagine that there's, I say, marinate in the sauce. There's an opportunity for people to kind of absorb your culture. So if they're coming in from an outside, you talk about hiring a guy from the Bronx who's coming into this space right here. That would be massively beneficial for somebody to experience something like that for a period of time before you put them in any situation or not.
That's exactly it. Now, we're always looking for people who have kind of the Midwest vibe to them, even if we're hiring them out of Dallas or California or wherever we're hiring them. But we're not saying that that's the absolute have to. We say that's why we do this kind of residency period of time, so that you can pick up the cultural sense of the chapel. But we're also expecting you to bring in an element of your own culture as the culture. It's like the universe. Yeah, I think it's like the chapel's always expanding its culture.
Yeah.
Because I don't want the culture of the Akron campus to be the culture of the chapel in any dynamic. I'll give you an example. When I first came here, the theology was very tight. And I knew if we were going to grow, some of the secondary issues of theology had to be let go. Now, as much, and Jay knows this, as much as I'm very tight theologically, I've had to realize to grow the kingdom of God, you have to be charitable with those things that are not essential. And so we, just in the area of, say, cessationism, give you one, and I could give you multiple.
Right.
That sounds like so dangerous to say you're going to allow those who have other views in the area of the gifts. Yes. Because we have really good men who are passionate about the gospel, and I believe that's a secondary issue. And if they think it's a secondary issue, and we can demonstrate as a group of pastors, that issue will not divide us. It will then not divide our churches. And so we come with the idea, we hold certain things we will die for. Others, we're going to open up and say, our churches theologically might not all look the same, but it's because the expanding of the chapel and its culture is the greater good.
Yeah, we've experienced that in Delaware a little bit with all of the churches. I've worked really hard to try to get all of the churches to be together in worship three times a year or so. And we it started with just myself, and then there's an African American church around the corner that I became friends with the pastor, and we combined our churches to do a worship service together, and then a third church, and then a fourth, and now there's about 15 churches that once a quarter we get together, and and all the churches come together and worship together, and then we have a guy speak. Usually it's one of the pastors from town, and then one of the worship teams from town will lead the worship time. And it's just that we had to sit down and say, okay, here's what matters, Jesus. And we're all very different, the Presbyterians and the United Methodist, and all those are different, but we can come together and worship together, really to demonstrate to the city that the kingdom of God is bigger than any one campus or church or iteration.
Absolutely. Unity in the essentials.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking
Now,
about.
I'll tell you, practically speaking, that's hard.
It's extremely hard.
Yeah. We're constantly having to be open in our conversations. And, the first time that I preached at this thing, it was at the Presbyterian church, and, they have a woman as a pastor. Well, to some very, old school conservative churches, that was a significant roadblock to get through.
Sure.
And so we had to work through that just in conversation. And, so there's always things that come up.
We do that. We tend to be complementarian here as part of the DNA of who we are. But in our community relations, we have to lay that down, because there's a African American church that has a wonderful pastor who's become a dear friend. Yeah. And I invite her into our pulpit on Good Friday, and you catch all kinds of flack for that. And I want to turn to people. I'm like, do you see what's going on? I mean, where else do you see this in society, where we have the multicultural diversity taking place without fights, without rampage in the street, without the political overtones? We've come together under the name of Christ, and we've done it in unity and love, and there's charity here. Isn't it about time we lay down some of the secondary things so that we can focus on the gospel of Jesus Christ? And that's been kind of the umbrella concept of campus planting, of saying, we're going to be about the gospel, and we're going to bring campus pastors in who we have an essential DNA, and we have we have a robust theological statement that you have to be a part of. But some of the secondary things we have to learn to be charitable towards. And I tell you, it just means you have to walk humbly.
So this is significant. I wanted to talk about the future of the church, where you see things going, particularly with the cultural onslaught that Christianity is kind of experiencing right now. So I think that's an excellent segue into that space. What do you think about that, the cultural climate right now, and where do you see the future of the church?
Go, Jay. I want to hear what you have to say.
I don't see myself as a prognosticator, in that. But I do see the culture of the church. It's going to have to be more charitable, as you stated.
I can see your avatar right now. Like right now, I think we could. Terra Nova needs, a total virtual campus and an avatar, Jason Allison.
An avatar, me? Okay. Yeah. I'm a little scared.
Can you work on that?
When Tim speaks, I listen. What was funny is years ago we were talking about the assessment thing, and I'll never forget it because I was like 20-something-year-old kid, hanging out with these. Well, you guys were in your 30s or something.
Yeah, we weren't that much older.
Right. And it was one of the first assessments, and it came back, you're a high D on the disc thing. And
unfortunately.
And it turned out I was a high D too.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I like the way this guy thinks. I'm going to pay attention to what he has to say. So an avatar.
Yeah. That's,
I cut you off.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking I see a lot of the church having to work together. Like, I mean, and going beyond denominational and congregational boundaries and being able to expand their understanding of the kingdom in bigger ways. You know, I mean, it's a small example, but like, you know, at Terra Nova, we don't have this thriving youth ministry because we just aren't that big. So instead, we partnered with the Presbyterian Church and the United Methodist Church, you know, around the corner, and we created a youth group between the three churches and partnered together. They send us a little money that we use to pay, you know, this youth pastor, and we've hired her to run this ministry. And I think that's one of the things that the church is going to have to be able to grasp and be able to move forward in this. Hey, things are bigger than our territory.
Okay.
We're going to have to understand, because, you know, it's with the internet, with all of the things that have happened over the last 20 years, you know, I get on my phone instant notification of things happening around the world.
Yeah.
I can't just focus on my little tiny kingdom.
Yeah.
You know, I've got to see bigger and be connected in more ways so that I can understand what's going on all around me, and then focus. And I think as we do that, we can stop fighting a culture war and instead start loving people, and it not matter if we are the prevailing power or not, because that's not the point. The point is that we are here to share what love is and what grace is, and that is the gospel. That is why Christ came. That is why we do that. And so we're going to have to find a new voice to do that, and it's going to be more than a pulpit, though that may be part of it, but that's going to be bigger than that. And it's going to be broader than that, and it's going to have to speak into multiple cultures at any given time.
Yeah. We're going to wrap it up here, but Tim, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I think we're in it's a really unique era, and our generations that we're in, you know, because I'm at the chapel and we're literally walking distance from the University of Akron, I get to be around a lot of emerging young thought, and I'm seeing more and more. I think the day of the mega church is past us. As much as we're still trying to hold on to it in America, especially in some of the metroplexes of our world, I think that day is culturally. Now, I think there's still time. I think there's still quite a bit of time of large churches, but I think the age group that is emerging today definitely shies away from the large type of church. And we're preparing ourselves for that.
Yeah, that's significant coming from you.
Yeah.
And this organization.
We're preparing ourselves in the way we think, in our vision, moving people out into smaller communities and smaller areas. And so I think we have to be mindful that I think the church is going to be much more community focused, much smaller, much more intimate. And how that develops, I actually think, if I can be a little prognosticator of the future, I think the generation beyond this one may revolt a bit on technology, and that they're going to want the intimacy of real community. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm sensing a stir that people are saying the isolation of technology has left me empty. Yeah. So that might be a whole nother podcast.
That sounds, we're going to have to do this again. I love it. That is incredible. That's what we're looking for. So before we close, real quick, Jason, what do you have coming up? Anything on the agenda with some of the things you're doing?
Just the Unfiltered Pastors Facebook Live group, etc. is January 31st is our next live showing, I don't know, whatever you
Okay.
call it, experience.
Yeah,
You can find it at Facebook /Unfiltered Pastors.
All right.
And that's coming up.
Okay. And Tim?
Yeah, we have two things that are really kind of taking a lot of our time and energy. Of course, the Worthy Walk. I think you called it the Unworthy Walk when we started. I love that. Steve, let's change the title. We're going from kind of a national radio platform where we were on a number of radio stations, a couple hundred radio stations across the country. We're moving that all digital, moving much more to podcast orientation, and so that's going to be fun, kind of a transition. And again, we're trying to be forward thinking, put our money and our thought and our energy towards future technology and burgeoning technology rather than what might be considered as old technology. And so there's quite a bit of transition going on there. And then, of course, what we had mentioned with church planting is our Saturate endeavor. And so if people are interested, if I can do a little plug,
Absolutely.
people are interested in learning more, saturate.life. We'll get you information about how to become part of our campus planting endeavors.
Awesome. Thank you guys for coming on the
Thank
program.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to our listeners, anybody who's tuning in and checking this out. Hopefully there's a few of you out there. We got some more great stuff coming your way in the coming weeks, and we'll see you soon.